The momentous statement made just over a century ago on behalf of Britain's cabinet on November 2nd, 1917, by the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Arthur James Balfour. Arthur James Balfour, what has come to be known as the Balfour Declaration, comprised a single sentence. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. End sentence. If before World War I, many prescient Palestinians had begun to regard the Zionist movement as a threat, the Balfour Declaration introduced a new and fearsome element. In the soft, deceptive language of diplomacy, with its ambiguous phrase approving, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, the Declaration effectively pledged Britain's support for Theodor Herzl's aims of a Jewish statehood, sovereignty, and control of immigration in the whole of Palestine. It's like, imagine that, the Scientologists decided to lobby the United States government or the British government to establish a national home for Scientologists on the basis of their origin story, where they claimed that there was their ancestral homeland. And let's just say they picked out Uganda, and they said, you know what, that is millions of years ago, according to our origin story, that is where the original Scientologists hail from. So give us all your weapons and your money so we can clear the pathway for that. I don't see it really any different. Any religious ideology that says, oh, we're going to have a national home is deeply troubling and should trouble everyone. And I think with the Scientologists consider what they do a religion, who's to say that any mythological origin story for any religion, so-called religion, was pursued in such a way? I mean, that's just unthinkable. Significantly, the overwhelming Arab majority of the population, around 94%, at that time, in 1917, the Arab majority of the population of Palestine was 94%. That went unmentioned by Arthur Balfour. So in his one-sentence declaration, which was a communique to, I think, the British Prime Minister, or I'm not sure if I think he was sending it to another government official, or maybe he was sending it to the Zionists themselves. But obviously that declaration made it formally known that the British government was going to help the Zionists establish this. They left out, conveniently, 94% of the population at that time. The Arab majority of the population of Palestine went unmentioned by the Balfour Declaration. How are you just going to exclude millions and millions of people? This is another interesting point too, because he said he does sort of mention it, but listen to this. I'll read you the sentence again in its entirety. Significantly, the overwhelming Arab majority of the population, around 94% at that time, went unmentioned by Balfour, except in a backhanded kind of way, as the, quote, existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So he references them by what they are not. He describes them in terms of what they are not, and certainly not as a nation or a people. The words Palestinian and Arab do not appear in the 67 words of the Declaration. This overwhelming majority of the population was promised only civil and religious rights, not political or national rights. By way of contrast, Arthur Balfour ascribed national rights to what he called, quote, the Jewish people, who in 1917 were a tiny minority of the country's inhabitants at just 6%. So taking 6% and then ascribing them an identity based on their religion, based on their Jewishness, Arthur Balfour, by the power invested by the British government, established a national territory that basically treated this 6% of the minority of that population as if they were the majority, or as not even as if they were the majority, but as if they had, supremacists, really, as like they were treated as if they were the majority and they had supreme, first right citizenship, to the detriment of the non-Jewish communities. But that's startling, to think about that. In 1917, there was 94% of the population of Palestine was the Arab majority, and you had the quote-unquote Jewish people who were in 1917 only 6% of the country's inhabitants. It's an interesting way of putting it, though, right? Arthur Balfour ascribed national rights to what he called the Jewish people, and that's the conflation, really. I mean, that's the entire, that simple conflation of a national territory with a religious ideology is sort of at the heart of all of this. Zionists can never answer these questions, can never have a response for these facts except for Darvo. I just thought it was funny that the streamer known as Destiny makes this clip about questions that pro-Palestinians can never answer, which is, with a Zionist, that's typical, right? Because every accusation is a confession. It's the Zionists that don't actually look at history, don't even pay attention to their own leaders, what they were saying and what they were carrying out. I mean, that's the thing about it, is that it's so public. They weren't shy about what they were doing, and they tell you. And when you hold these quotations up to them, they do not have a response, because what they are saying is directly antithetical to what the leaders and the people that established the State of Israel said. Okay, so before securing British backing, the Zionist movement had been a colonizing project in search of a great power patron. So before securing British backing, the Zionist movement had been a colonizing project in search of a great power patron. This must have been ever since it was formally, I guess, jotted down in a notebook, the ideas of Zionism by Theodor Herzl in 1890 or thereabouts, leading up to the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Having failed to find a sponsor in the Ottoman Empire, in Wilhelmine Germany, and elsewhere, Theodor Herzl's successor, Chaim Weizmann, which is a beautiful name that really rolls off the tongue, and his colleagues finally met with success in their approach to the wartime British cabinet led by David Lloyd George, who was also a devout anti-Semite, by the way. That's another important point that we should make known, is that the people that established Israel were raging anti-Semites. If there ever was such a thing as anti-Semitism, it was the British Parliament. I shit you not. The Palestinians now faced a far more formidable adversary than ever before, with British troops at that very moment advancing northward and occupying their country. Troops who served a government that had pledged to implant a national home wherein unlimited immigration was meant to produce a future Jewish majority. And that's what it's always been about, is establishing a Jewish majority. And how do you do that if you are literally the minority and you're outnumbered by millions of people? You have to expel them with violence. Either you kill them outright, or you make them live in fear so that they don't, they want to leave, they want to run away. And that's exactly what the Zionists did with the quote-unquote iron wall that Vladimir Jabotinsky talks about, which was necessary, in his view, of sustaining a settler colonial project, which he acknowledged was in fact Zionism. And he is an early Zionist leader as well, which is, in fact, he's talked about in the next page. This is the first declaration of war. This is 1917 to 1939. So this is the interwar period. That's what's known as the interwar period, between world wars. The end of World War I, 1917, and the beginning of World War II, 1939. So in that time, it was the British Mandate of Palestine, and they were able to basically force all these illegal Jewish settlements via collective punishment against the Arab majority, perpetrating these crazy war crime massacres where they would burn all these villages to the ground, round up the people in the village and just execute them. There's, story after story after story after story after story of these massacres, which were perpetrated by Israeli Zionist, you could say, you couldn't call them Israeli quite yet because Israel hadn't been established yet, but they were Zionist what they call paramilitary forces, which were really just terror organizations that conduct collective punishment, damage to civilian property, mass executions, all with British weaponry. I'm on page 25. Okay, we talked about David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Britain in the interwar period, around the time of the Balfour Declaration, and when, you know, the state was formally created, the British Mandate of Palestine in, what, 1922, I believe. The British government's intentions and objectives at the time have been amply analyzed over the past century. Among its many motivations were both a romantic, religiously derived, philo-Semitic desire to return the Hebrews to the land of the Bible, and an anti-Semitic wish to reduce Jewish immigration to Britain, linked to a conviction that world Jewry had the power to keep newly revolutionary Russia fighting in the war and bring the United States into it. All right, that's a big sentence. Let's go over that. It's almost a paragraph, just that one sentence. But let's start from the top. The British government's intentions and objectives at the time were this. Among its many motivations were both a romantic, religiously derived philo-Semitic desire. That's a lot of adjectives to describe their desire to return the Hebrews to the land of the Bible. The Bible, and they had an anti-Semitic desire. They had an anti-Semitic wish to reduce Jewish immigration to Britain. So does that make sense to you? The British Parliament, the British cabinet had a twofold desire to send the Jews to Palestine, way out in BFE, literally, so that they could be far the fuck away from the great island of Britain. So yeah, let's send them to Palestine. Who gives a who's out there? Nobody knows. It's our mandate. It's our own territory, so we can do whatever we wish. Never mind the 94% of the people that are living there that are not Jews, by the way. Okay. So they had this conviction of world Jewry. It was like this conspiracy that they had the power to keep newly revolutionary Russia fighting in the war and bring the United States into it. Okay. So beyond those impulses, Britain primarily desired control over Palestine for geopolitical strategic reasons that antedated World War I, and that had only been reinforced by wartime events. Okay. So beyond those impulses, Britain primarily desired control over Palestine for geopolitical strategic reasons that antedated World War I and that had only been reinforced by wartime events. However important the other motivations may have been, this was the central one, that the British Empire was never motivated by altruism. Britain's strategic interests were perfectly served by its sponsorship of the Zionist project. Now, this is an idea, now that I'm reading this, I'm thinking back to some of the things I've said, and it comports with my own conception of world affairs, in that Zionism is pursued because it's profitable. It's profitable for Zionists to proliferate, or for the Zionist project to be promoted and to be enacted, because it makes money for the capitalists. And that is a fundamental truism, by the way, of societies in general, that things are pursued because they're economically viable and they bring about a greater quantitative number of commodities, literally, okay? If we're speaking very materially here, the reason that these projects, movements, whatever the superstructure of ideology it is co-opted by, the real reason is because it's profitable. Nobody's gonna pursue an idea that isn't profitable. This makes perfect sense as to why a government would pursue the Zionist project. And here you have Rashid Khalidi saying that. So however important the other motivations may have been, this was the central one, that the British Empire was never motivated by altruism. Britain's strategic interests were perfectly served by its sponsorship of the Zionist project, just as they were served by a range of regional wartime undertakings. Among them were commitments made in 1915 and 1916 promising independence to the Arabs, led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca, and a secret 1916 deal with France, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which the two powers agreed to a colonial partition of the Eastern Arab countries. I'm going to do a lot of rereading so that it sticks, but among them were commitments. So we're talking about, obviously we're still talking about Britain's motivations here for supporting and sponsoring the Zionist project, but among them were commitments made in 15 and 16 promising independence to the Arabs, and a secret deal with France called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which the two powers agreed to a colonial partition of the Eastern Arab countries. So does the superstructure only perpetuate ideologies that aid the base? I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think I should temper this by saying that I'm not saying this is it's a fundamental truism, I think, but it can also work the other way. Like, I'm not saying it's always the economy that influences the superstructure, never the other way around. I think that the superstructure at times can also, I mean, they play back on each other, but I think, with a broad stroke, it's true to say that it's the economic base which primarily influences the superstructure that is our ideology. So all, religious. But you see, okay, so this is actually a really good question, because in the book, in the book How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney tackles this exact point that we're talking about, which is that the base influences the superstructure. But yet the superstructure can influence the economic base at a certain point. For instance, he argues in Africa, in the time of communalism, let's say, or in the early civilizations in Africa, the way that they organized and their lack of real knowledge, scientific knowledge, which had yet to be developed, basically created the religious ideology, like how they organized. And because they couldn't explain their material world, they didn't have the tools or the knowledge yet so they would invent things. And that's the problem with religion, is that it starts with the ideal to explain the material. And we as materialists have learned to understand that the material world influences the ideals, the ideas about our world. I don't want to go over your head or anything. I don't think what I'm trying to say is really that crazy, or I'm not trying to be abstract about it. Get back to the example, Walter Rodney's example. They would try to explain and rationalize their world through religion. And as man became more scientific, like, they realized, oh, well, maybe that's not really a good way of thinking. To give you an example of the superstructure of religious ideology influencing the economic base of society, think about, for example, a religious idea that a certain forest was sacred and couldn't be chopped down. Well, that would impede economic development in this context, in this example, because that forest could be chopped down for, all sorts of resources. It's not being done because of religious reasons. That's an example of the religious ideology influencing the economic base. That forest is not going to get chopped down now, and now the economic base it's hindered, let's say. Sorry, that was a tangent. It got my mind thinking about a separate book, and I was trying to tie that into that idea. Yeah, superstructure gives concessions to appease the base. After a certain amount of time, that's what happened with the secularization of society, because as we as a human race became more knowledgeable and scientific about the material world, we started to reject some of these religious ideas. They didn't cut it, we could disprove it, like, the earth being the center of the universe, or, I don't have very good examples, but I think you can think of some where this might be true. But religion had to be sort of compartmentalized, I guess, in society. Anyway, getting back to the story at hand. So why did we talk about all that? Why did we go on to that tangent? That's because he made the point, Rashid Khalidi, in this book, The 100 Years' War in Palestine, that Zionism was being pursued by the British cabinet, by the British government, because it was advantageous for their strategic, domination over that region of the world, so they can control the resources. I mean, the Middle East is one of the greatest sources of wealth, and in the 50s, the United States State Department called it the most strategic prize in world history. So this political ideology of Zionism is pursued because it's profitable for its patrons, okay? So at a dinner at Balfour's home in 1922, three of the most prominent British statesmen of the era, Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, who I forget was he was a British government official, but I don't remember his official title. I should know that, though. And the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Winston Churchill, assured Weizmann. Does everybody know who Weizmann is? That's the successor to Theodor Herzl in the Zionist movement. So they're having dinner with Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist movement at the time in 1922, is having dinner with three prominent British government officials, and they assured Weizmann that by the term Jewish national home, they always meant an eventual Jewish state. Lloyd George convinced the Zionist leader that for this reason, Britain would never allow representative government in Palestine, nor did it. So privately, they are recanting what the Balfour Declaration said publicly. You know, they were a little bit less sugar-coated, let's just say, in their language privately when they're meeting with the Zionist leader, as they would be naturally in a public, document like the Balfour Declaration. So for Zionists, their enterprise was now backed by an indispensable iron wall, quote unquote, of British military might. In the words of Ziev Jabotinsky, which is, I think his name is also, they also call him Vladimir Jabotinsky. Ziev Jabotinsky. So he's the one that famously said colonizing Palestine could proceed only with the backing of the iron wall of the British Empire, which was able to, force the indigenous literally out of the territory via an iron wall, literally describing an apartheid state, okay? So for the inhabitants of Palestine, whose future it ultimately decided, Balfour's careful, calibrated prose was in effect a gun pointed directly at their heads. A declaration of war by the British Empire on the indigenous population. The majority now faced the prospect of being outnumbered by unlimited Jewish immigration to a country then almost completely Arab in its population and culture. Whether intended this way or not, the declaration launched a full-blown colonial conflict, a century-long assault on the Palestinian people aimed at fostering an exclusivist national home at their expense. The Palestinian reaction to the Balfour Declaration was late in coming and initially was relatively muted. Word of the British pronouncement had spread in most other parts of the world immediately following its promulgation. Now, we're talking about the Balfour Declaration. I should see if everyone that's in this chat should be able to tell me what year that was. So if you know the year, put it in the comments, just to test your knowledge. I'll wait. Okay, but everybody should know the year. So the Palestinian reaction to the Balfour Declaration was late in coming and initially was relatively muted. Word of the British pronouncement had spread in most parts of the other world immediately following its promulgation. In Palestine, however, local newspapers had been shuttered since the beginning of the war by both government censorship and a lack of newsprint, the result of a tight Allied naval blockade of Ottoman ports. After British troops occupied Jerusalem in December of 1917, the military regime banned publication of news of the declaration. Indeed, the British authorities did not allow the newspapers to reappear in Palestine for nearly 2 years, so they didn't even know. They had no idea. It took years for them to even hear about the Balfour Declaration that was happening. Yes, okay, so you guys know, but yeah, you guys are getting it right. The Balfour Declaration was 1917. Thank you. Okay, so when reports finally did reach Palestine of the Balfour Declaration, they trickled in slowly via word of mouth and then through copies of Egyptian newspapers that travelers brought from Cairo. The bombshell struck a society prostrate and exhausted at this late stage of the war, when survivors of the chaos and displacement were slowly returning to their homes. There is evidence that they reacted with shock to the news. In December of 1918, 33 exiled Palestinians who had just made their way from Anatolia to Damascus sent an advanced letter of protest to the peace conference being convened in Versailles and to the British Foreign Office. They stressed that, quote, "This country is our country," and expressed their horror at the Zionist claim that, quote, "Palestine would be turned into a national home for them," end quote. Such prospects may have seemed remote to many Palestinians when the Balfour Declaration was issued, at a time when Jews constituted a tiny minority of the population. Nonetheless, some far-sighted individuals had discerned the danger posed by Zionism early on. In 1914, Isa al-Isa wrote in an astute editorial in Philistine of, quote, a nation threatened with disappearance by the Zionist tide in this Palestinian land, a nation which is threatened in its very being with expulsion from its homeland. Those who felt trepidation about the encroachment of the Zionist movement were alarmed by its ability to purchase large tracts of fertile land from which the indigenous peasants were removed, and by its success in increasing Jewish immigration. Yes, I'm reading this. I've already read it, okay? And that's why I'm rereading it again, because it's so damn good.